the Biden administration took it upon themselves to try and be leaders in regulating AI and published an executive order on October 30th. This long anticipated executive order covers a very broad range of matters in a 111-page order document. It covers very specific actions in very detailed terms. It uses technical terms of art. And I think it creates as much confusion as it does provide clarity. It's an executive order, so it's not legislation. And there's much in here that some would argue needs to be legislated. As an executive order, it can be overturned very quickly and easily by the next administration. It largely demands voluntary action from technology companies to submit their models, infrastructure, and tools for review, for proof of safety.
Don't forget the equity and inclusion.
There's an equity inclusion component, which is that your models have to account for
diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a phrase from the executive order. The term dual-use foundational model means an AI model that is trained on broad data, generally uses self-supervision, contains at least tens of billions of parameters, is applicable across a wide range of contexts, and that exhibits high levels of performance at tasks that pose a serious risk to security, national economic security, public safety, or any combination of those matters, none of which ultimately describes endpoints, none of which describes loss or applications. To me, this is the biggest problem I see with the executive order and with the approach to AI regulation broadly, particularly with what's being developed and has been leaked in terms of what's being developed out of the EU, which is that many of these government agencies, government actors, are trying to define and regulate systems and methods rather than regulate outcomes and applications. For example, if you were to say you cannot commit fraud and falsely impersonate someone using software, you can rightly say that. It follows the rule of law, and we should be able to adjudicate that cleanly in courts. Instead, to have government agencies and have what this executive order describes as a chief AI officer in every federal agency responsible for regulating the systems and methods of all the actors and all the private companies that are building software, to say this is the scale that your software can get to. You can have a certain number of parameters. If you're bigger than this number of parameters, we have to come in and check your software, creates an outlandish standard, and one that makes absolutely no sense, particularly in the context of the pace of AI's progression. Remember, the paper that was foundational to transformer model development, which is what a lot of people call AI today, which has developed these LLMs and so on, came out in 2017 and wasn't really widely adopted until 2018 as a standard. We're 5 years into this. So the way that we're making models, the types of models we're building, the scale of the models, the number of parameters being used, the pace at which these things is changing is staggering. We are only in the first inning. And so to come out and say, here are the standards by which we want to now regulate you, this is the size that the model can be, these are the types of models, it's going to look like medieval literature in 3 years. None of the stuff's even going to apply anymore. I'm just really of the point of view, as you guys know, that the market needs to be allowed to develop. If we don't allow our market to develop in the United States, India and China and Singapore and other markets will get well ahead of us in terms of their model development and their capabilities as a nation and their capabilities as an industry. And the more our government actors step in and try and tell us what systems and methods we are allowed to use to build stuff, the more at risk we are of falling behind. That's my general statement on the matter. I'll pass the mic. I mean, Chamath, you were advocating for AI regs a couple months ago, I think, right? I mean, where does this fall with respect to what you were advocating for and what you were concerned about?
Well, I had a very specific lens that I viewed this stuff through, and they didn't really address it. I think that this was a little bit of a kitchen sink EO, and I think what probably happened was depending on, look, I mean, I think the thing is like, look, when this process first started, it started in the Senate and it started with the Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer. And I met with Chuck and then I met with Chuck's team. And then it morphed into this much bigger thing. And I think it morphed into a lot of people trying to do the right thing, meeting with a lot of very important and very famous people. And I think somewhere along the way, it just became this convoluted and confused document, because I do agree with you that it's not super coherent. There's a lot of arbitrary requirements, like I think there's a requirement here that at a certain number of parameters, you have to like self-report yourself to the government. which is like, what does that even mean? Why is that even important? So it's just a lot of random stuff. So it just seems like anybody who had the ear of the people writing this had a chance to write something in. So it's a little confusing. It's not going to do the job. And I think that you're right. In 2 or 3 years, we're going to look back and this is going to look medieval.
I'll point out another point, just one of many that I could highlight in this document. I read most of it. They say, there's got to be legislation on watermarking AI content. Think about that for a second. What is AI content? We've been using Adobe Photoshop for 30 years to change photographs and change documents. We've been using various tools for doing audio generation and music. I mean, there's no music that doesn't run through a digital processor of some sort. There's no video. There's no movies that don't have some degree of CGI elements or some degree of post-production digital rendering integrated into the video itself. What makes something AI? Is it the fact that 100% of the pixels are generated by software? What if it's only 98%? Is Pixar AI? Because all of Pixar is made on computers. Is the auto-tune hip-hop artist AI? Because his voice isn't coming through on the audio track. So what is AI in this definition? The fact that any piece of content needs to be watermarked if it's AI, I think is one of the most outlandish infringements on First Amendment rights I've seen, and doesn't really understand in any sense how software is generally used in the world today, which is frankly everywhere. And to say that now there is a certain definition of a certain type of software that we're going to arbitrarily call AI, we want to watermark the stuff, and we want to get a stamp on that content so that the government can track it and audit it, I think is absurd. Zach, over to you.
Yeah, okay. Three quick points here. Number one, AI has been convicted of a pre-crime. This EO, it describes this litany of horribles, this parade of horribles that's going to happen unless, the wise people in the central government like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris guide its development. So that's what the EO says it's going to do, is guide the development of this technology. Because if we don't, it's going to result in all these horrible things happening. Steven Sinofsky, who was a key executive of Microsoft I think going back to the 80s, wrote a really interesting blog post about this, where he was there at the beginning of the PC revolution with the dawn of the microprocessor in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And he pulled a bunch of books off his bookshelf from that time period, which were sort of these sci-fi books like Forecasting Doom, Infringement on Privacy. One was called The Assault on Privacy. Another one was called Electronic Nightmare. Another one was called The Rise of the Computer State, and so on. And so it was also predicting all these horrible things that would come from the birth of the computer. And it would put all these people out of work and so on.
Totally.
But nobody allowed these fears to guide the development of the industry. There was no executive order at that time saying that we're going to guide the development of the microprocessor to avoid all of these harms that haven't occurred yet. And instead, we're taking a different approach here. And he makes the point that if the industry had been guided in that way, then it never would have achieved the potential that it ultimately achieved. And furthermore, he makes the point that a company like IBM would have been more than happy to work with the regulators to say, yeah, let's define a bunch of these rules to make sure that it doesn't go in this dark direction that everyone thinks it's going to go in. And you would have gotten very extreme regulatory capture.
Can I precog one of the crazy lines in this thing? Here are the precogs. Here's one. When a foreign person transacts with an infrastructure as a service provider, so Azure, Google Cloud, Amazon, to train a large AI model with potential capabilities that could be used in malicious cyber-enabled activity, they propose regulation that requires that IaaS provider to submit a report. So if you have to know, if a foreigner is using your APIs on AWS and then file a TPS report.
Oh my God.
Somewhere. What is going on? I have a clarifying question. What happens if you're a foreigner that's on an H-1B at Facebook or, Microsoft?
Good question.
Well, and
you
then
are technically a foreigner.
Right. And then Chamath, meanwhile, remember when SpaceX is now being sued by the DOJ because they haven't employed enough foreigners? So it's like they outlaw both sides of it so that you're in non-compliance just by existing.